Hi everybody, this is the causes of the Civil War video that we uh, said you needed to watch for class on Monday or Tuesday, depending on when your course drop day was. You'll need to take notes on this. This is a longer video that's a lot more detailed than some of the videos we've done in the past. The Civil War has a lot of causes. These are just some of them, but a lot of these connect well with Manifest Destiny, and it's really important that you understand it's all of these different things combined that lead up to the Civil War. So we'll go over this in more detail in class, but I want you to have the basic understandings here. And remember, as we've discussed before, uh, feel free to write down questions that you have, and there probably will be questions about this material. So when you come to class, we can answer them, and you'll feel comfortable with the material before we go forward with it. We are going to write an essay on a topic related to this, so this stuff will all be helpful. And you may want to revisit this video from time to time to help you, because I will go through it rather quickly. One of the first causes of the Civil War goes all the way back to 1820. If we wanted to, we probably could go back before 1820 and find causes even at the very beginning of the Constitution. Remember, we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise and the debate about slavery even when we were founding the country. So there's lots of different places we could start. I chose to start with the Missouri Compromise. This is a map of the United States in the year 1820. One of the things you'll notice is if you count the states, states in green are free states where slavery was illegal at this time. States in orange are states where slavery was legal. If you count them, you'll notice that there's an equal number. And this was on purpose to keep a balance in the Senate. So half of the votes came from free states and half of the votes came from slave states. We were admitting states one at a time, one at a time. There was a problem, though. Missouri was ready to become a state in 1820. It wanted to become a state, slave state, um, but it was a state that was large, extended fairly far north into territory that had previously been free. So if you notice, it went all the way up to almost the northern part of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. That was all free territory prior to this. So there was some debate about that, and also there was no free state that was ready to become a state of the United States at the same time as Missouri was ready to become a slave state. And this was going to upset the balance. And there was a huge debate that came up, and after a long, sort of torturous discussion in the Congress, they eventually compromised and took the state of Maine. You see that up in the top corner. Maine was a part of Massachusetts until 1820. They made Maine its own state, admitted as a free state to balance out with Missouri being a slave state. They also did something that's more important. If you notice on the map, there is this red line in the southern part of Missouri. That's the line at the 36th parallel 30th degree north latitude. They agreed that every bit of territory north of that line in the Louisiana Purchase, so everything that says unorganized territory in green on the map, would be in the future admitted as a free state. So this means that in the future there'd be much more free state territory than slave state territory admitted from this Louisiana Purchase. And that made the northern states happy with the compromise. They were willing to allow Missouri to be a slave state because of that, and it kept the balance. And they thought that this compromise had solved the slavery question forever. But, as you know from class, that's not the case. Slavery continues to, or the United States continues to expand because of Manifest Destiny. And after the Mexican War, the Mexican American War, we're going to get all of the southwestern part of the United States. And now the question becomes, what do we do with that territory? I'm sorry, I went one too fast. Should that territory extend uh, to slavery? Some of it is very far in the south, or should that not all be free? And there were lots of ideas kicked around in Congress. One was just to extend that 3630 Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which would have cut that territory in half. Some people, like a politician named Wilmot from Pennsylvania, wanted to get a proviso put into the law that said there would be no slavery in any of the territory that we got from Mexico at all. This wasn't acceptable to the southern states. There were some people in favor of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is a complicated word for letting the people vote. So some people said, look, why don't we just let the people in each new state vote? And if they want slavery, they can have it. And if they don't, they won't. The good news for the United States in 1848, when we get all this new territory, is they were thinking to themselves, it'll be a long time before any of these new Mexican territories are ready to become states. Remember, if you look at a map, as we will, of America in 1848, there weren't any states on the West Coast. The furthest west state at that point was Missouri, and Texas. So they thought it would be a while before enough people moved to these western areas of the United States for any of them to become a state. Something changes that plan drastically, and that something is the California Gold Rush. This is still part of the second cause. When California finds gold in 1849, tons of people move there very quickly. And by 1850, California has enough population to become a state. They thought they wouldn't have to deal with this slavery issue quickly, but because of the California Gold Rush, they have to make some quick decisions. If you think about a gold rush, you ask yourself what kind of people would move to California to dig in the mud, in rivers, and pan for gold. You realize pretty quickly that the people who are willing to give up everything and move to California, which was a risky, potentially deadly thing to do, were people who didn't have a lot to give up in the first place. Poorer immigrants, workers, people who didn't have slaves, people who didn't have big farms, people who weren't well established in society. So very few people with slaves moved to California. And if the people in California in 1850 had been allowed to vote, everyone knew they would have voted to make California a free state and not a slave state. Because if you think about it, none of these people had any experience with slavery because they were mostly poor Northerners and immigrants. This made for a really very sort of explosive situation because California was a large state. If you admitted it as a free state, it would have thrown off the balance. There was no other slave state ready to come in at the same time. And it looked for a while like 1850 was going to be the year that we started a civil war because the North and the South were sort of at each other's throats about what to do about this new Mexican land, specifically what to do about California. The man who negotiated the Missouri Compromise, his name was Henry Clay, famous American politician, ran for president numerous times. He created the Missouri Compromise. He's still in Congress 30 years later in 1850, and he crafts a very delicate compromise called the Compromise of 1850. This took 4 months months and months in Congress to debate. It had 4 parts. It's a very complicated idea, and essentially it took some things that the North wanted and some things that the South wanted and combined them together into a package that enough people would vote for that it would become law. The next slide is going to list the 4 parts of the Missouri Compromise. The first is that California got to become a state, and that California would be a free state. That we would admit no other new slave state at the same time as California became a free state. That was a big step, and a big concession for the North. If you think about, each of the things in this compromise, did it make the North happy or the South happy? That's clearly something that makes the North happy. They agreed that the rest of the land we got from Mexico, that's the Mexican Cession territory, that land would be subject to popular sovereignty. So that land would let the people in those places vote on whether or not they wanted to become a slave state or not. That's not really that big of an issue in American history because other than California, none of that other territory is ready to become a state until after the Civil War. So that sort of is a moot point. It's really not that important. You could not know it and you'd be fine for our conversations. The third part of the compromise was the banning of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Not the banning of slavery in Washington, D.C., but the banning of the sale of slaves in Washington, D.C. This was a particularly big problem for a lot of Northerners because Washington, D.C. is where ambassadors to the United States from other countries would be. Most other countries in the world had already banned slavery. So when you had people visiting the United States as ambassadors, seeing human beings being sold on street corners, it was a particularly offensive thing to them. So to sort of like hide slavery a little bit in Washington, D.C., they banned the sale of slaves. That's another thing that the North wanted. So if you look at the first 3 things on this compromise, 2 of the 3 are things that the North wanted, that the free states wanted. One is something that both sides roughly agreed on. So we know that the last part of the Compromise of 1850 is something that the South is going to love to make it a fair bargain. And that's exactly right, because what the South gets out of the Compromise of 1850 is this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act. Such an important piece of legislation that it actually will call it a cause of the Civil War all on its own. The Fugitive Slave Act said that if you helped a slave run away, you could be put in jail and pay a significant fine. This was very, very, very powerful idea because prior to this point, I'm sure you've heard of the Underground Railroad. You know that slaves run away. This was a way to force people in the North who were against slavery to help catch runaway slaves and send them back south. This law would be enforced in the entire country. It would not just be enforced in the South or in the border states. So this would force many people to report runaway slaves, to catch runaway slaves, and if they didn't, they could be punished as a result. This was incredibly controversial. It was really controversial in places around the Cleveland area. There's a huge riot that breaks out in Oberlin, which was a big center for anti-slavery action in the 1850s because slave catchers come to Oberlin to try to catch a runaway slave, and the people refuse to follow the law. And you get these conflicts where the government is supposed to be enforcing this law, and Southerners are pushing the government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. But the people in the northern states, at least many of them, don't want to follow it. If you look at this poster, which is a poster from the city of Boston, you can see how the police in Boston, no matter how they felt about slavery, were being forced to catch and return runaway slaves. And you also can see how it would be possible to catch someone who is a freed African American and force them back into slavery. If you've seen or heard about the recent movie 12 Years a Slave, that's exactly what happened in that movie, which is based on an actual case of a freed black man in the North who was forced into slavery because he was caught by a slave catcher and couldn't prove that he wasn't a runaway slave. So the Fugitive Slave Act radicalizes a lot of people in the North. It makes them hate slavery because now they're forced to be a part of it, forced to catch runaway slaves in a point where before they could just ignore it and pretend like it didn't happen. The fourth cause of the Civil War is probably the most complicated. It has a lot to do with building railroads. Now that you have a gold rush in California, and California and Oregon have become states by the 1850s, there's the need to build a transcontinental railroad. It was really dangerous to cross the United States. There were no roads, no good paths of transportation. In fact, most people, it was safer to get on a boat in New York, sail down to Panama, take a train across Panama, get on another boat in the Pacific Ocean, and take a boat all the way back up to San Francisco. That was quicker than going across the land in the United States. Everyone agrees there needs to be a transcontinental railroad built, and politicians in the Congress are debating and jockeying to try to get the train to go through their state. Stephen Douglas is a very powerful senator from Illinois. He wants the transcontinental railroad to be built through Chicago. Obviously, Chicago's in Illinois, it would help his state. He thought that was a good idea. The problem was that the law said that the train could only be built through territory that was organized, meaning that it was on its way towards becoming a state. Let me show this to you on a map so that it makes some sense. We'll go back to that slide in a second. The map on the top is a map of America after the Compromise of 1850. You can see that if I was going to draw a line west from Illinois into California, which would have been the path of the Transcontinental Railroad, it would go through the unorganized territory, and the law said that that was not allowed. In order to get around this part of the law, it was proposed by Stephen Douglas to take the unorganized territory and break it up into territory that was on its way to becoming a state. To break it up into the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory. And you can see on your map, the map below, that this is what he proposed. His law was called the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it divided up the unorganized territory into Kansas and Nebraska, which would have allowed him to build his train. The problem becomes that when you take this territory and you organize it towards becoming a state, it reopens the whole slavery question. In order to get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed through Congress, they had to repeal the Missouri Compromise line from 1820. If you notice, both the Kansas and Nebraska territory were north of the Missouri Compromise line. That means, based on the previous agreements, both should have been free states. Southerners thought that wasn't fair. Again, they're already thinking and seeing that they're going to be outnumbered in Congress. They're afraid that at some point people will vote to ban slavery. So Stephen Douglas agrees to get rid of that compromise line and instead allow Kansas and Nebraska the opportunity to vote on if they're going to allow slavery in their territory. This makes people very, very, very upset, because you're taking a compromise that had kept the peace and been in place for 34 years, and you're throwing it away, and instead you're allowing people to vote. One of the questions you need to ask yourself is, what kind of people were going to be motivated to move to Kansas in order to vote in an election about slavery? And the answer to that question is that the most extreme people on both sides of this question were the ones who were willing to give up everything to move to Kansas, to vote in this election to try to change the outcome of whether or not Kansas would become a free state or a slave state. So you get a situation where the state of Kansas, which has a very low population, there's a flood of immigrants to the state, but the people who come are either extreme abolitionists, meaning those that are against slavery in a very radical way, or extreme pro-slavery people who want to expand slavery at any cost. But in Kansas, they become next-door neighbors. And that creates a situation where violence could break out, really with little or no provocation. And that's exactly what happened. We call the fifth cause of the Civil War Bleeding Kansas because violence breaks out over the question of the voting that will take place. One of the people that moves to Kansas is an abolitionist named John Brown. If any of you are from Hudson or have ever been into Hudson, right outside of Cleveland, John Brown was a minister in Hudson he wasn't from Hudson, but for a large part of his life, somewhere in the ballpark of 20 years, he lived in Hudson. And he was an incredibly extreme anti-slavery person. He spoke out regularly against slavery. He thought that slavery was evil on every level and one of the most awful parts of the United States. He moves with 5 of his sons, and he had 20 kids, so that was a lot. He moves with 5 of his sons to Kansas in order to try to influence the vote and pressure people to vote against slavery when it comes up for a vote in Kansas. Well, one night, several of John Brown's supporters murder a number of people who were supporters of slavery. This is called the Pottawatomie Massacre. It's only 5 people, only in quotation marks, 5 people that are killed. But this is one of the times where now blood is being spilled and there's open violence between those who are against the abolition of, or against expanding slavery, and those who want to continue expanding it. And this, again, steps up the level of radicalization, steps up the level of anger that people have about slavery in the United States. The sixth cause of the Civil War is a very famous Supreme Court case about a man named Dred Scott. This is a painting of Dred Scott here on the right. Dred Scott was a slave. He was a well-educated slave. He served as his master's secretary, and he kept business records and things for his master. And he frequently went on trips with his master into free states like Illinois and Wisconsin. And lawyers for Dred Scott argued that because of this, because he had gone into free states on a regular basis, states where slavery was illegal, that the moment he stepped into a free state, he should have been free. That because it's illegal to have slavery in Illinois, he should have become a free man, and thus, he should have been freed. This was a really controversial case, and the Supreme Court took it seriously. The outcome of the case was quite shocking to a lot of people. The Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was still a slave. But they actually went a step further. The majority in this Supreme Court case, in the Dred Scott case said that because slaves were property, and because the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment says that the government may not take away a person's property without just cause, that it was actually impossible to get rid of slavery without a constitutional amendment. Let's think about that for a second. If the Constitution says that the government may not take your property without just cause, this means that even if the abolitionists could get enough people in Congress to pass a law to ban slavery, that law would violate the Constitution. Because if a slave is a person's property, then taking away the slave master's property violated their constitutional rights. This meant the only way to abolish slavery would be to amend the Constitution, which basically was impossible, because you would never be able to get 3/4 of the states of the United States to vote to make a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, because just under half of them allowed slavery in the first place. For people like John Brown, when they hear about the Dred Scott case, they realize that they can't work through the government in order to fix the problem of slavery. That the only option is to change the Constitution, change the government, replace the government, and that violence becomes an acceptable answer. And as we'll see, John Brown will use violence one more time in probably the most important cause of the Civil War. A big political thing that happens, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this, is that the Republican Party is created in the 1850s around this debate over slavery. As we've talked about before, the two main political parties prior to the 1850s were the Democrats and the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. The Whigs were a party that was focused on economic issues. Because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the debate over slavery, the Whig Party basically explodes. You have Southern Whigs who support slavery and Northern Whigs who are against slavery. They can't agree to be in the same party anymore. So the Northern Whigs walk out of the Whig Party and they group with some other minor parties and they form a new political party called the Republicans. And it's at this time that Democrats and Republicans are running against each other. And from that point forward, obviously up until the present, those are the two major parties in the United States. The Republican Party is a party that's born about anti-slavery and the expansion of slavery in the United States. That was the reason for the creation of the Republican Party, and our politics is still shaped by these questions around the Civil War. Back to our friend John Brown. Because of the Dred Scott case, he realizes that you can't work through the government. You have to actually overthrow the government in order to get the change that he wants with regards to abolishing slavery. He gets together another large group of his supporters, and their plan is to attack a federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. This is a picture of what Harpers Ferry looks like today. It's a beautiful place. You can go visit it. And their goal was to attack this arsenal, which was a building where there were lots of weapons stored, steal those weapons, give them to slaves on nearby plantations, create a slave army that would march from plantation to plantation, killing the slave owners and freeing all of the slaves. So John Brown comes up with this wild, violent idea on how we're going to end slavery in the United States. The raid fails, he's captured, he'll be executed. But sort of the myth, the legend of John Brown lives on after his death. People in America have a huge debate about what kind of a person John Brown actually is. To abolitionists, to anti-slavery supporters, John Brown is a martyr. He's someone who died for a good and just cause for what he believed in. He was just doing a just thing to try to end slavery. To slaveholders, he's the devil. He's willing to use violence to kill them to take away their way of life. So there probably isn't a more polarizing figure in American history than John Brown. Some people love him, see him as a hero. Some people hate him. But to Southerners, when they see John Brown willing to use violence to end their way of life, they're horrified. They think that the North is out to get slavery and end it, which actually was not true for most people in the North, and that this fear about the use of violence to get rid of slavery will cause them to become more radical. This takes place in an election year, the election of 1860. And it made Americans more divided than ever about the question of slavery. Abraham Lincoln is the Republican candidate for president in 1860. Um, Abraham Lincoln did not favor abolishing slavery, at least initially. He wanted to stop the expansion of slavery, and that in and of itself was enough to make the southern states hate him. The problem for the Democratic Party was they couldn't agree on who their nominee for president should be. Initially, they picked our friend Stephen Douglas. He's the railroad guy. He's from Illinois, though, and the problem is, even though he says he supports slavery, they don't really believe him. So many Democrats in the South pick someone who's even more pro-slavery than Stephen Douglas, a guy called John Breckinridge, and they split their party in half. They can't agree on one candidate, so they run both of them against Lincoln. And you can probably see where this is headed. If you have two Democrats running and one Republican, the Democrats will split the Democratic vote and make it possible for the Republican to win. Because of this split in the Democratic Party, Lincoln looks like the likely winner in 1860. Southerners say flat out, if Lincoln wins the election, they will leave the country. Not all the southern states, but South Carolina and a couple of others make that crystal clear from the beginning. You get a third Democratic candidate to join the election. He's the Constitutional Union Party. His goal is to say, "I won't vote for me. I won't change anything." But all John Bell running as a third party candidate does is split the vote even further and increase the likelihood that Lincoln will win the election. So when you look at the electoral map of the election of 1860, in a four-way race, Lincoln wins the election. Only 40% of Americans voted for Lincoln in the 1860 election. But because the other three candidates split the vote, Lincoln is able to become president. If you look at the map, Lincoln is blue. He wins almost all the northern states. Every state that didn't allow slavery voted for Lincoln. But all the other states were divided amongst the various candidates. And that meant that Lincoln would become president in a very divided election. And this is the beginning of the Civil War. When Lincoln is elected, Southerners secede, beginning with South Carolina. It takes about a year for all the states to make the decision to leave in the South, and that will be what begins the Civil War. I know that was a lot of information, and I went through it pretty fast. You may want to listen to it again, or pause periodically and go back and look at some of the information that we talked about, and we will spend as much time as necessary in class to answer questions and go over all of this material. So I hope that that helps to sort of explain the cause of the Civil War, and we'll be spending the rest of the week talking about the actual Civil War itself and how it was fought.